Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is, of course, the museum's weekly Chats on the Past program, where we discuss history with scholars, authors, historians, artisans, and other people in the history and preservation fields. My name is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Director of Programs and Education at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. At the museum, as always, we are pleased to offer this program free of charge, but we do, of course, always ask that you support the museum however you can. We do have a suggested donation of $5 for all of our programs, but we understand this is a difficult time. If you've been enjoying our programs and you want to hear more about them, if you'd like to get alerts and notifications when we are doing live programs, you can always follow us and like us on our Facebook and Twitter pages at Westport History and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. During our program tonight, if you have any questions, comments, anecdotes, any feedback that you'd like to give, I do encourage you to use the comments box, the chats box, or the questions and answer box. I will monitor those and we will get to as many of your questions as we can at the end of our program tonight. This evening, we are joined by Christopher Wiegren. He is an architectural historian and Deputy Director of Preservation Connecticut. His articles and essays have appeared in the Hartford Courant, the New Haven Register, and the Connecticut Explored magazine. And currently he lives in New Haven, Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Chris.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here.
We're so glad to have you. So I'm going to turn it over to you at this point. I know you have a presentation to go over with us this evening before we come back for questions afterwards.
All right, good. Let's see if this... All right, thank you. Well, I'm here to talk about my book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. And it begins with a bit of confusion. You'll notice that it says on the book cover, Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, but the logo on the right says Preservation Connecticut. The organization I work for changed its name at the beginning of the year. I'm up to about 85% getting it right, but we'll have this historical record on the book to keep people reminded of the former identity forever, I hope. This book was published in 2018, and it's an introduction to architecture around the state through stories about 100 specific works of architecture. I define architecture for this purpose very broadly as making places, shaping the world to create places in which to live, places to work, places to worship, places to play, all kinds of places to carry out our lives. This means buildings, of course, individually, but also buildings in groups, campuses, neighborhoods, streetscapes. It also can refer to other kinds of structures like bridges or dams, as well as landscapes and sometimes interior designs which are created independently of the structures they occupy. This is not a best of book. It's got some well-known favorites in it, but it's got some unknowns or little knowns as well. The idea is to showcase the variety and richness of Connecticut's architectural heritage, to make the case for preserving works of architecture, and to encourage readers to get out and look for themselves. The looking for themselves part is a bit problematic these days. The pandemic has cut down on our ability to travel, and particularly going inside buildings around the state. So I thought tonight I would focus on landscapes, outdoor places that you can visit more safely. Most of the places I talk about are open to the public, a few aren't, but it should be fairly obvious. And that also will give us then an opportunity to think about another issue facing the world, and that's our relation to the natural order. So shaping the landscape. All architecture begins with the land. Historically, the shape of the land determined where people settled, how they made their living, what materials they had to build with. In Connecticut, the fertile soils and open meadows of the Connecticut River Valley supported farming, while the swift-flowing streams of the Quinebaug-Shetucket and Naugatuck-Housatonic river systems gave power for mills and factories. Cities grew up on harbors or rivers at points where navigation was promising, and agricultural towns grew up on hilltops, away from the dangers of flooding or from what settlers thought was unhealthy lowland air. At the same time, the people of Connecticut haven't merely built on the land, they've altered the land itself to meet their needs and desires, to ease their work, or even to give pleasure. They've divided it into fields and towns, dammed streams and rivers, excavated hillsides, filled valleys, created parks and gardens, asserting for better or worse their mastery over their environment. As we'll see, nature has ways of reasserting itself. So I'm going to talk about some of the 100 places in the book. And as I said, they're all landscapes in some sense or other tonight. We begin in Montville at Mohegan Hill. The common image of Native American building in the Northeast is temporary structures. English colonists recorded wigwams as ephemeral structures of bent saplings covered with bark. But the environmental historian William Cronin has shown that Native peoples also shaped the landscape. They cleared fields for crops, managed woodlands to attract game and make hunting easier, and built weirs to catch fish. Some of the rock piles and stone cellars hidden in Connecticut forests are believed to be Indian structures. How can traces of Native American building be located today? One starting point is the Mohegan Congregational Church, which you see here on Mohegan Hill in Uncasville, which is a part of the town of Montville. The church was established in 1831, at a time when the federal government was forcibly removing Indians from their ancestral lands. Building a Christian church demonstrated that the Mohegans had been, so to speak, civilized and posed no threat to their white neighbors. The strategy worked, and they were allowed to stay where they were. After the reservation was broken up in the 1860s, the church remained as the only property still owned by the tribe. The site for the church had been chosen for specific, significant reasons. Mohegan Hill had been meaningful to the tribe long before 1831. All around the church are features important to the Mohegans, including Moshup's Rock, which bears an indentation identified as a giant's footprint. There also are formations where the Makiawisug, or Little People, lived, and Uncas's Spring, associated with the leader of the tribe in their split from the Pequots in the early 1600s. In the 1860s, Mohegan Hill became the site of the tribe's annual Wigwam Festival, an event of spiritual significance revived to cement tribal identity. The festival is a thanksgiving for the harvest and an expression of hospitality to the Mohegans' neighbors. Tribal members would build a large brush arbor known as the wigwam, derived from a word that means welcome. In it, they served food and displayed crafts. The festival no longer takes place on Mohegan Hill, but the hill remains central to the life of the tribe. Remembered, visited, celebrated, sometimes reinterpreted, the hill is central to the tribe's identity. But although the Mohegans have constructed buildings on the hill and altered its landscape, its significance is rooted in an earlier, non-European concept of place that arises not from human actions, but rather from discovering the significance seen as inherent in its natural features. The identification and continued use of places like Mohegan Hill are among the ways Native Americans shaped their environment, and these should be considered as the first Connecticut architecture. After the Native Americans, Europeans arrived and began working the land and creating farming landscapes. One of them is in South Windsor. Blessed with some of the most fertile soil in New England, the Connecticut River Valley developed into a flourishing agricultural region by the 18th century. Prosperous farming towns lined the river from Connecticut through Massachusetts and into Vermont and New Hampshire. One piece of this world survives in South Windsor, where Main Street, the old Riverside Road, has been bypassed by modern-day Route 5, leaving an historic landscape that extends for nearly 5 miles. South Windsor was settled by inhabitants of Windsor on the opposite bank of the river in the late 17th century. One section of the corridor eventually became a community called Windsor Farms. The north, a separate community called East Windsor Hill, grew up around a ferry landing from which merchants shipped agricultural products to New York and the West Indies, and where they received imported goods to sell to the local population. Some of these merchants made fortunes and built splendid houses. Windsor Farms didn't produce such wealth until well into the 19th century, when tobacco became a lucrative agricultural product. Impressive as they are, the great houses are only part of a bigger picture. Also of note are rows of trees that line the street, barns and other outbuildings, warehouses, stores, workers' homes, and boarding houses. Today, suburban infill is on the increase, but for the moment, it remains largely unobtrusive. Most important to note is the land itself. This steps up and back from the river in a series of terraces. The first level is alluvial plain. It's containing fertile sediment and devoted almost entirely to cropland, now as it was 300 years ago. From it, a steep bank leads up to a second tier where the street runs above the flooding level and where most of the buildings are concentrated. Beyond the buildings are more fields and another rise up to the level of Route 5. This topography determined the shape of the settlement. The inhabitants divided the land into narrow strips running east from the river, which gave each property owner a bit of each type of land: fields for crops, a home lot on the street, pasture, and woodland farther in. From the air, this pattern is still visible in the parallel field divisions and roads that run back from the river. You can see all the lines running left and right in this photograph. You're looking more or less north along Main Street. Predating any surviving structures, this landscape still provides the framework for South Windsor's life and development, a living inheritance from colonial days. An important part of agriculture in Connecticut is tobacco. Well suited to the well-drained, fertile soil of the Connecticut River Valley, tobacco has been grown in Connecticut since the 17th century, but it didn't become a major cash crop until the 19th century, when tobacco for cigars became the valley's most important agricultural product. In the 1920s, more than 30,000 acres of tobacco were under cultivation in the state. Today, even with declines in smoking, plus the high cost of labor needed to tend and harvest the plants, and the pressures of suburbanization, tobacco farming still survives in some corners of the valley. The most obvious evidence of tobacco growing is the distinctive barns, called tobacco sheds, that are used for curing the leaves. The New England tobacco shed is an identifiable regional type, and it's different from tobacco barns in other parts of the country. It's long and narrow, with board siding covering a timber frame, and vents that can be opened and closed to regulate airflow. To catch the prevailing breezes, sheds are often built in parallel rows, like herds of cattle all facing into the wind. But there's more to tobacco farms than the sheds. Since about 1900, Connecticut farmers have specialized in thin-leafed tobacco that's used for cigar wrappers, the outer layer of the cigars. This type of tobacco needs a humid environment and filtered sunlight to replicate conditions in Sumatra, where it originated. In the early 20th century, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station developed the method of growing this tobacco under gauze tents, which shelter the plants from the sun and hold in humidity. Together, sheds, fields, and tents make up a complete tobacco landscape. During the course of a year, plants are set out and grow, eventually becoming taller than a person. The tenting is stretched out on wires running between poles, turning the summertime fields white. When harvest time comes, the side curtains are folded back so the workers can get in to pick the leaves. They then are sewed into bundles and hung in the sheds to be cured. Depending on the breeze and the temperature and the humidity, the side vents are either opened or closed. When they're open, the solid, windowless sheds become skeletal frames hung with bundles of leaves that change color from green to gold. Like the natural landscape, the human-made tobacco landscape is constantly in flux as the plants grow, as the tenting is extended to enclose them or opened for harvesting, as the shed louvers are opened or closed. It echoes the rhythm of the growing year, a cycle that repeats over and over and over. Not all landscapes are utilitarian or working landscapes, of course. Connecticut has many great estates as well with ornamental landscapes. One of the greatest of these is the summer home of Edward Harkness and his wife Mary, called Eolia, and now it's Harkness State Park. This was one of the grandest estates built on the Connecticut shore in the period between the Civil War and World War I. The mansion, surrounded by its gardens, sits on 235 acres. The real reason to see Eolia is its landscape. Park-like grounds surround the house, and the original entry drive winds through stone-walled fields, orchards, and pastures, dotted with barns, greenhouses, and other agricultural buildings. All this makes it clear that Eolia was not only a summer retreat, but also a working farm that supplied food for the Harknesses when they were in residence here and also at their home in New York City. At the heart of the landscape are extensive gardens which Mary Harkness supervised personally. The original garden plan by the Boston landscape firm of Brett and Hall was strongly symmetrical and relied heavily on architectural features such as walls and pergolas. The plantings were equally formal, consisting of rows of annuals in bright colors. After 1919, Mary Harkness turned to Beatrix Farrand to redesign the gardens. Farrand was one of several women who broke into landscape architecture by designing gardens for the rich. Her first work at Eolia was the Asian-inspired East Garden. That's what you see in the picture here. Designed to display statuary that the Harknesses collected on their travels in the Orient. In the West Garden, she replaced the rigid rows of annuals with drifts of perennials in softer colors. The use of billowing, informal plantings in a formal geometric framework is typical of Farrand's work and can be traced back to the influential English garden designer Gertrude Jekyll. Farrand also added a rock garden and a secluded box parterre. Since Eolia was a summer home, Farrand didn't have to worry about what the gardens would look like off-season. But a view from the air or a winter visit will reveal the bones of the landscape. Without the mitigating softness of the plantings, one can more easily perceive the formality of the layout. You're seeing the West Garden here now. It's divided into room-like spaces, each with a different character, but tied together by axial views. Note the transitions from one space to another, marked by gates or steps, and experience the contrast between the sheltered parterre, you can see that geometric design in the lower right, or the sunny exposed rock garden to its right, very informal and looking. This underlying structure gives the garden its strength as a place. Here's a different kind of estate, closer to Westport, Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan. One of the most famous buildings in the world, the Glass House is a poster child for the modernist vision of revolutionary new architecture, totally different from that of the past. Its designer and owner, Philip Johnson, was a leading evangelist of this new faith. For his own house, Johnson took modernist design to its logical extreme. He used industrial materials, steel and glass, in simple geometric forms to create a universal space with no partitions except for the bathroom. The Glass House does not stand alone. It was built with a companion, the brick house or a guest house. And over the years, Johnson added other structures to the estate as well. Over the course of his long career, his approach to architecture varied a lot, and you can sort of read that development through the buildings of the estate. Johnson and his partner, David Whitney, would move from one building to another, depending on what they were doing or what the weather was like. Unlike the Glass House, the other buildings mostly have rather solid walls, with small windows and tightly controlled views to the outside. The key to the relationship between the Glass House and these other buildings is the landscape. As much as Johnson loved building, he also loved shaping the land. Over the years, he cleared much of the second growth woods on the site to reveal the contours of the land, which slopes down from the road to a shelf on which the Glass House perches, and then plunges down again to the pond, while stretching north and south into more fields, which are divided by stone walls and dotted with trees. With its transparent walls, the Glass House looks out on this landscape. As Johnson himself put it, the views act as wallpaper. Within the landscape, the other buildings punctuate views and vistas. Like temples in an English landscape garden, they're follies, built more for appearance than practicality, and frequently playing games with form or scale or structure. The miniature pond pavilion misleads viewers about its size and distance from the hilltop. The Glass House itself is the ultimate folly, freezing in winter, broiling in summer, totally lacking in privacy, triumphantly unlivable. It's an idea rather than a home. At the same time, the distinction between the buildings and their setting remains strong. With few exceptions, there's no effort to blend the architecture into the landscape. Through all his stylistic experimentations, Johnson remained true to one aspect of the European modernism that he championed in the 1930s, and that is the celebration of machine-made materials. The relationship between buildings and landscapes for him is always one of contrast. Landscapes surround our great institutions as well, and sometimes play a role in carrying out their mission. 19th century Romantic thought believed strongly in the restorative qualities of nature. Frederick Law Olmsted, the Hartford-born pioneer of American landscape architecture, wrote, "The enjoyment of scenery employs the mind without fatigue and yet exercises it, tranquilizes it and yet enlivens it, and thus gives the effect of refreshing rest and reinvigoration of the whole system." This belief lay behind the development of urban parks in the 19th century. New York's Central Park by Olmsted and Calvert Vaux is the best known example, although Hartford's Bushnell Park actually was begun slightly earlier. Hartford also boasts a more direct example of landscape design for healing. In 1824, one of the country's first mental hospitals, the Connecticut Retreat for the Insane, opened on the city's southern outskirts. By 1860, the retreat's superintendent, John S. Butler, wanted to improve the grounds, which he considered rough and wet and, quote, "of little use," unquote. He envisioned a setting that would contribute to the treatment of patients, what he called a therapeutic Arcadia. Butler commissioned a landscape design from Olmsted and Vaux. However, with the outbreak of the Civil War in the next year, Olmsted left to run the United States Sanitary Commission. Jacob Weidenmann, a Swiss immigrant, was engaged to finalize and execute the plan. Trained in architecture, engineering, and horticulture, Weidenmann was overseeing the design and construction of Bushnell Park at the same time. Though smaller, the retreat landscape resembled those of Central and Bushnell Parks. Around the edges of the property, dense plantings created a buffer against the city. Inside this were rolling lawns dotted with trees, either in clumps or as single specimens. Grading and drainage improvements solved the wetness problem, forming a base for winding paths and roadways. There was a flower garden and an activity building called the Museum, where patients could undergo further therapy. You can see the museum in the upper right there. In 1868, Vaux, with his partner Frederick Clark Withers, expanded the retreat building. They added verandas and turrets and decorative gables that gave the structure a picturesque outline in harmony with that of the landscape. There's the building. Over the years, the retreat, now called the Institute of Living, continued to grow. New buildings and parking lots have replaced much of the outer buffer, but the central area remains largely unchanged, with its lawns, curving paths, and naturalistic clumps of shrubs and trees. Some of the specimen trees still survive from the 1860s. In Butler's vision, this landscape served a broader audience, not just the patients at the retreat. From the first, he opened the ground to the public to demonstrate, as he wrote, that the externals of a lunatic asylum need not be repulsive, and that its inner life is not without its cheerful, home-like aspects. The Institute of Living still continues this tradition, offering this peaceful, verdant setting to patients and public alike for what Olmsted called refreshing rest and reinvigoration of the whole system. All that mention of parks reminds us also that landscapes can be designed for entertainment. One of them, very different from Central Park, is Lime Rock Park in Salisbury. As soon as automobiles were invented, drivers began racing them. As with horses, some raced on enclosed oval tracks, while others preferred open country roads with their more challenging configurations and better scenery. By the 1950s, the dangers of this practice led to the development of tracks that evoked the experience of open road racing in a controlled environment. One of the first of these was built at Lime Rock, a village in the town of Salisbury, where sports car enthusiast Jim Vale had taken to driving in a gravel pit. Deciding to build a proper track, Vale enlisted John Fitch, a race car driver who had witnessed terrible crashes and was committed to make racing safer. Fitch, in turn, asked engineers from the Cornell Aeronautical Engineering Laboratory to review the layout and recommend safety improvements. It just so happened the lab's director, Bill Millikan, also was a racing fan. The resulting racetrack is 1.5 miles long and has 7 curves in varying shapes to test the driver's skill. The design takes into account the engineer's recommendations for curvature, banking, and elevation. There also are recovery and deceleration lanes to give drivers a chance to regain control or slow down so that collisions don't cause serious injuries or damage. There are barriers designed to stop cars safely, to be portable and replaceable, and to allow emergency access to disabled vehicles. The involvement by the Cornell lab at Lime Rock was a first in racetrack design and reflected the founders' broader ambitions in shaping the new sport of automobile racing. Along with its safety features, the landscape defines Lime Rock Park. Unlike other racetracks, it has no grandstands. Instead, spectators sit on grassy slopes, dotted with maple and oak trees, screened by rows of pines. There are views to a church steeple in the village, and beyond that to rolling hills. The park-like setting makes going to the races an informal, festive event. There's space to arrange picnic blankets and chairs, either in the shade or the sun. Children can sleep or play while grown-ups watch the races. Spectators can move about easily to watch the action from different vantage points. Much thought went into making Lime Rock Park. In addition to engineering the racetrack to balance safety with thrills, all the practical needs of drainage and screening and parking and crowd control had to be satisfied. Most important was integrating these practical necessities with the beauty of the surroundings to create an inviting setting for the fun of watching the races. The crowds that flock to Lime Rock on summer afternoons attest to the success of its creators. More automobiles, but this is public infrastructure, I guess. Connecticut's beloved Merritt Parkway. At the groundbreaking for the Parkway in 1934, the road's namesake, Congressman Schuyler Merritt, summarized the road's purpose. He said it is not being built primarily to get from one place to another as rapidly as possible, but is being built to enjoy as you go. The Merritt grew out of efforts to bypass congestion on the Boston Post Road. But instead of a wider, faster version of the Post Road, the Connecticut Highway Department built a parkway, a road in a landscaped setting designed for pleasurable driving. This idea was inspired by the City Beautiful movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which produced grand public works based on the idea that beauty was a public asset. Merritt's well known for its bridges, but they're unusual. Stone was too expensive for Connecticut in the depths of the Depression. The Highway Department's architect, George Dunkelberger, molded ordinary concrete into works of art or whimsy. But the bridges are really just a garnish, intended to enhance the real star of the show, which is the landscape. For Thayer Chase, the landscape architect, the task was to heal the scars of construction and blend the parkway seamlessly into the surrounding countryside. To accomplish this, he used native plants, grouped informally, and matched to what was already growing nearby. In some cases, he imitated natural succession, planting quick-growing weed trees to shelter the laurels until slower-growing oaks could mature. It was a great satisfaction to me, Chase said, when people would ask, "But what did you do?" Although Chase wanted the landscape to look natural, it was carefully designed. He cited plantings to enhance bridges or lead the eyes to views. At curves and exits, shrubs shielded drivers from oncoming headlights. And Chase specified more flowering plants than would occur naturally, including tens of thousands of mountain laurels, Connecticut state flower. The landscape matured as intended through the 1940s, but as maintenance budgets were cut, new growth increasingly obscured Chase's vistas and enclosed the roadway in a nearly continuous tunnel of greenery. Since the 1990s, the Department of Transportation has been removing overgrowth and restoring plantings as it gradually repairs and improves the park's roadways as well. However, in 2016, the department began clear-cutting a wide swath along the roadway to remove trees perceived as potential hazards. Because this is considered emergency work, it's being done without waiting to complete plans or secure funding for restoring the landscape. The effect is devastating, as weeds and brush take over the barren, cleared areas with amazing speed. Fortunately, Thayer Chase's work in the 1930s offers hope. Today's builders can design a landscape that will heal these scars, just as Chase did. The concept is flexible. Details can be quite different, as long as the idea of a road in a natural-looking park remains constant. What is important is the experience of the parkway. With care, the Merritt can continue to be a road to enjoy as we go. One more infrastructure work, the Rocky River Hydroelectric Plant, not pant, I'm sorry about that, in New Milford. In the 20th century, new technologies made it possible to reshape the environment on an unprecedented scale. Road building filled valleys and cut through mountains. Reclamation projects turned wetlands into dry ground. Irrigation transformed deserts into lush suburban lawns. Mighty rivers were dammed to create reservoirs to satisfy ever-increasing demands for water and electricity. Around 1900, it was found that high-tension electrical current could be transmitted for greater distances than had previously been considered feasible. Based on this discovery, the Hartford businessman J. Henry Rohrabaugh consolidated several smaller electric companies into the Connecticut Light and Power Company, which constructed a system of reservoirs and power plants to provide power to Connecticut cities. The Housatonic River offered great potential for power generation, but seasonal fluctuations made it an unreliable source. To address this problem, CL&P built the first major pumped storage hydroelectric facility in the United States. Beginning in 1926, the company constructed a dam 100 feet high and 952 feet long, blocking the Rocky River, a tributary to the Housatonic. This created Candlewood Lake. When the river is high, water is pumped up 200 feet to the lake. When the river is low or demand is high, water can be released from the lake and run back down to turn turbines and generate electricity. Pumping the water up actually uses more power than is produced on the return trip, but ensuring a reliable supply was considered to be worth the effort. So in this view, you're standing with your back to the Housatonic River, the dam is in front of you, and that big pipe running up the hillside is where the water is either pumped up or allowed to run back down. Behind you is the powerhouse, a lofty brick structure tall enough so that the turbines can be lifted out of their housings for servicing. Full-length windows emphasize the building's height and provide natural light for monitoring dials and machinery within. Across the road, the penstock, that's the giant tube 15 feet in diameter, carries water up the hillside to the lake or allows it to flow back down to the power plant when needed. Candlewood Lake, created by that dam, flooded more than 8 square miles in the towns of Danbury, Brookfield, New Fairfield, New Milford, and Sherman. It's 11 miles long and has more than 60 miles of shoreline. This was change on a massive scale. CLNP not only built an electric plant, the company created a new landscape miles long that has attracted development in the form of vacation cottages and year-round homes. The lake also attracted a different mix of plants and animals and fish and birds. In essence, it has created a new ecosystem that in the ensuing decades achieved its own stability. It's natural, but not completely so, because it depends on the human-made facility. For as solid as that dam seems to be, it also is fragile. Without ongoing human intervention in the form of maintenance, the water behind the dam, always seeking to run downhill, eventually will break through or flow around it. It will flood the towns downstream, leave lakefront property high and dry, and wipe out the Candlewood ecosystem. It's a useful reminder that whatever people build, they build in opposition to the laws of nature. And in the end, nature will win out. So those are some of the sites I write about in the book. I hope that you'll find that it's more than that, it's really just a starting point that will inspire you to learn more about Connecticut and its architecture and to see and experience it for yourselves. I worked for many years with Elizabeth Mills Brown, an architectural historian who was very much of a mentor to me. And she, in a talk once said, sort of summed up the whole idea of architecture and preservation. She said, architecture is for everyone, and there's enough to go around if we'll only learn to take care of it. We can't write it all down on convenient lists that we can carry in our pockets, but it's all around you wherever you go. So go out, keep your eyes open, enjoy every bit of it, whether it's on somebody's list or not, and above all, guard it. So the book is Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. You can order it through the Connecticut Trust, through Preservation Connecticut's website. If you've got questions or comments or whatever in the following days, you're welcome to contact me at my email address as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. Those are really fascinating structures, and I'm excited to visit many of them, and I hope all of you will consider visiting them as well. So we do have a couple of questions that we wanted to ask, and I wonder, Chris, if you would tell us a little bit about how this book came about. How did you start on this journey to creating Connecticut architecture?
It's been a long time coming. Actually, Betty Brown, whom I mentioned, Elizabeth Mills Brown, started work many years, more than 30 years ago, on what was going to be a statewide guidebook. I was hired to do some research for her, and after a while got promoted to co-author, but eventually got to the point where she was no longer able to continue the project, and it went dormant for a while. And the then Connecticut Trust, Preservation Connecticut, where I work, board and staff decided that we really need a book about the architecture of Connecticut. There isn't one. So I was assigned to get out there and write the book, and in the process sort of changed my vision of what it would be. So that's So in a way, it took about 4 years to write. In another way, it took about 25 or 30 or so, depending on how you count it.
Amazing. I'm glad it's a book that does exist. It's, I think, extremely valuable. Even though it took between 5 and 30 years, I'm glad that it did come.
Yes. There were some people who had their doubts. But.
Speaking about the creation of the book, what resources were you using? Obviously, there are beautiful photographs in the book, but what other primary sources? I expect you did a lot of visits to many of these sites, but what other sources were you able to use to create the information that's presented?
A lot of the basic information came from various studies created through the historic preservation movement, the National Register and State Register of Historic Places, surveys of towns that are sponsored usually by the State Historic Preservation Office. Those sort of preservation studies, you know, this is one of the purpose they serve, is to get information out that people can use to as at least beginning points for further research. Visited a lot of places, worked my way through a lot of architectural journals and magazines, some of them going back to the 19th century. Town histories were very useful as well. I had the resources and the files of Preservation Connecticut as well. A lot of the photographs came from there. I also had some volunteers who took photographs for me, were interested in the project and offered to go out and spend their Saturdays driving around taking pictures of places.
That sounds like a great way to spend a weekend or an afternoon. I would have loved to have done that. That sounds amazing. One of the themes that does come up in the book includes what is called emphasizing the importance of the built environment and its impact on our sense of place. I wondered if you would elaborate on those a little bit more and maybe tell us what maybe some of the goals of the book are.
Yeah. But the goals I said earlier on, one of the goals were to help build appreciation for the diversity of Connecticut architecture. If you say Connecticut architecture to a lot of people, they'll either see a saltbox house or a white meeting house or whatever. And there's all kinds of things, factories and bridges and dams and suburbs and lighthouses and iron furnaces and parkways. There's all kinds of ways that people have shaped the place in which we live. And that physical environment, affects our day-to-day lives, whether you're sitting in a traffic jam on the Merritt Parkway or going to work in a suburban office park or living in a colonial house that has weathered the centuries. It's like the old quote from Winston Churchill, we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. And having these things around helps us to be a little bit aware of our past, our history, and what makes us special. Why is Connecticut not California? Why is Connecticut not Croatia? Now you begin to get some idea of that just by having a red painted salt box and a modernist church or school and a Victorian Gothic state capitol around as you go through your daily life. So that these places, aside from just being amazing works of art, some of them in their own case, they make the past present with us in a vivid way. They maybe remind us that just as people in the past built well, most of the time, well, I don't know, most of the time, some of the time at least, in ways that we benefit from. As we build, we have a responsibility to build well for future generations as well.
I can definitely understand built structures. Part of the museum's building is a National Historic Site, so we definitely understand the need for preservation of these historic places and it creating a sense of place. Westport has some beautiful buildings and some unique buildings as well, which is really fabulous. Now, the last question that I have for this evening, and I don't know if you're allowed to tell us, Chris, but do you have a favorite?
It's the last one I looked at.
We will take that, yeah.
Okay,
I think they're all fabulous.
I'll confess that I've been involved for a long time with the Merritt Parkway, and that's certainly a very special place to me. Again, for its artistry, for the idea that public infrastructure is not only utilitarian, that it can be created to be an asset to the community, and that we can, be able, just the amazing concept that highways can be nice and not just places to survive as we get from one place to another.
It does have some beautiful bridges, and some of the restoration work that is happening is really, really lovely to see. As aggravating as the Merritt can be sometimes, it's when you're stuck on the Merritt, it is beautiful to look around and to take a moment.
Yeah, if you're going to be stuck on the highway, it's better to be stuck on the Merritt and look at trees and bridges than to be stuck on 95.
Oh, yes, definitely, definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, Chris. We've had a lovely time looking at all of those buildings. As Chris mentioned, the book can be got online. The URL will be down below in our comment box if you are looking for it. Is there anything else that you would like to leave our attendees with, Chris, before we sign off for the evening?
Just thank you for coming, and enjoy exploring.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.